Well, once again, welcome to the show. It's Tuesday, and I like to connect up with my friend Eric Peters. And Eric, truth be told, this is more of a therapy session for me than not, but I appreciate your straightforward, freedom-based approach. And I'll start by asking, how are you doing?
Well, it's a little cold here in Southwest Virginia. And of course, today is a day of moment. You may be aware that on the ballot, there's a special election today that will determine whether the state is going to get redistricted and in such a way that will assure, from what I understand, a lock of the blue hairs on the state's political apparatus. And I've become kind of fatalistic about it. I'm not even going to bother to vote. I know probably some people listening to me will be appalled to hear me say that, but I've gotten so turned off by the whole thing. At least I'll wash my hands of it, and I won't have to suffer from the depression that I feel right now for having been duped and guiled into voting for Trump back in 2024. Even Tucker, did you catch it? Tucker issued a public apology for having, as he put it, being complicit in the
Wow.
election of Donald Trump. And again, I think it's fair. It's we were lied to and we were betrayed. You know,
No, I don't disagree. And was it Tim Kaine that I heard talking about like the redistricting issue there in Virginia? I think he said the quiet part out loud because someone was saying, well, but look, you've got 90% Democratic representation and Virginia's not 90% Democrats. And his
no,
answer was, but we have to do something to counter, the Trump administration's agenda.
yeah, and even more ominous. This is, as I understand it, the first test case of this idea that whoever wins the popular vote will also be given all of the electoral votes. In other words, they're going to try to do an end run around the electoral college and make it, if you will, a direct democracy.
Yeah, that has some potential problems as well. Okay, so let me ask you this. By the way, I don't disagree with the idea of withholding your vote. I think voting equals consent in some ways, even if your vote is not for the current folks in power. But one of the only options we have sometimes is to withhold that consent. And people will complain and say, "Well, if you didn't vote, you have no reason to complain." Feels to me like it should be just the opposite.
Yeah,
If you abstained, you're not complicit.
there's something degrading about participating in your own encirclement. That's how I look at this at this point. It's kind of a groveling before the prison warden. Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. You gave me an extra piece of dry bread today. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's really the only power that we still have. I don't believe that there is any effective power any longer in voting because look what happens. It's become a meme, if you will. Vote harder next time, right? Nothing changes. Everything gets worse. The best case scenario seems to be that it gets worse a little bit more slowly than it would have otherwise. So, I wish I had a better option, but opting out, passive resistance, those sorts of things, they do have power. I do think, granted, it's improbable, but if enough of us withheld our consent, can you imagine if 40 or 50% people just said, no, I'm not having anything to do with this? The whole system would grind to a halt. It would be obviously illegitimate. They couldn't any longer pretend that this is, quote unquote, a democracy. The people have spoken. No, a minority of people are imposing their will on everybody else. And ultimately, I think that's the only way we're ever going to get out from under this.
I think you're onto something there. And I think that would reasonably, I think that would make more sense because at some point people would realize this is not about let's represent the people and let's represent what's good for everybody. But no, you're going to do what we tell you or else, the mask comes off at that point.
Sure. And I think it's baked into the cake. There's something inherently problematic about the idea, even with the best of intentions, of any single individual representing, let's say, even 50,000 people. Let's put it as relatively small congressional district terms. How does that happen? We use these terms, and I think these terms are not the correct terms. If I retain an attorney, then he is my representative. I hire the attorney. He acts on my behalf according to my specific instructions. He can only do the things legally that I authorize him to do. And if he doesn't do them, I've got the power to fire the guy and hire another lawyer. But when we vote, we're sort of giving this blanket proxy power to these so-called representatives who then do whatever they want to do. And what recourse do we have? Well, we get to vote for another representative, and rinse and repeat. So it's functionally problematic, even with the best of intentions. But the fact is, we get the worst kind of people in these types of dynamic situations, because after all, what sort of a person generally wants to do that for a living, particularly? At one time it was literally public service. A person had a life and a job and a career, and maybe they would take a few months out of the year to do something for a brief period of time politically. Now it's become, we all talk about it. These people are in there for 50 years. Some of them
Right.
longer than that. And all the while they're getting richer and richer and richer, and we're getting poorer and poorer and poorer.
And
You know,
even people who get into it for the right reasons, people who go in there, not as power seekers, not as opportunists, but, I'm here to serve the people. The longer they are there, the more likely they will start to become part of the machinery.
sure, the money is just too big. You need the backing of big, big money in order to run for any national level office, congressman, let alone a senator, governor, excuse me, or the presidency. So you get corrupted by that inevitably. Who are you going to listen to as a congressman or a senator when there's a knock on your door and it's somebody from Raytheon, or it's you or me? Who's going to get in the door? It's not going to be you or me.
Yeah, the person with the
That's the
six-figure
reality.
check is going to get
Yeah.
preference. Now, I do have an idea, and this is sparked because Uncle Sam had his way with me last week, but I would really love to see tax day moved from April 15th to the first Monday in November. And I would like to see withholding stopped so
Yes.
that if you do owe taxes, that's the day you write your check to the IRS so it's fully in view of how much you are paying to your federal government and, by extension, your state government. Election day will be the next day. Tell me
Yeah.
we wouldn't see some changes.
Those are two, I think, potentially very effective reforms. That don't necessarily entail challenging the entire apparatus of the system, just a way to confront, to get people to realize what they're living with passively. Withholding was an evil genius thing they came up with, to take your money before you even get to have it in your hand, so that most people aren't even aware they've been fleeced because it's gone. And then they're grateful because they get a refund. They
Yep.
get a refund. That's what they call it, without interest, by the way. But you're right.
Yeah.
Can you imagine if American taxpayers had to cut a check, a big check, every November had to write a check for $10,000, $15,000 to the federal government just before an election? I think that would have a very salutary effect on the political process, and that's exactly why they'll never do it.
Well, if I had a dream, that would be my dream. Let's move tax day to the day before election day, and then let the chips fall where they may. Some people may be perfectly happy. Others, those who are walking funny like I am, will be inclined to vote for change because we're not going to be as appreciative of the ruling class. And by the way, I appreciate what you said about the just how demeaning it is to cheer for someone who promises you brighter chains than the other guy.
Yeah, yeah. And again, you and have talked about this on previous episodes, but I feel, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I feel the wheel is turning a little bit. And because of Trump, ironically, I think he has disabused a lot of people of the notion that voting harder next time is going to be the cure for what ails us.
Yep. Now there are a couple of exceptions, and this is going to be different from state to state. I know in Virginia right now with Spanberger, you guys are facing a very difficult uphill battle. Where I live in Idaho, I believe that if a person wants to have their influence felt, the local level is probably the most likely place they can make that happen. Possibly the state level, although we're finding out to the dismay of many, including myself, that big agriculture, basically the big corporate interests really call most of the shots. And it's not done through big overt bills or anything like that. It's done through legislators that they control who sit on key committees, committee chairmen who will take a particular bill that, let's just say, isn't as favorable to a particular industry as they would like. And that chairman will just put that bill in the drawer and there it sits. It's never seeing the light of day and never given the debate and able to either rise or fall on its own merits. It just quietly goes there to die in the chairman's drawer.
Yeah, I think the money has rendered institutional corruption, and it was inevitable that that's going to happen. Because people get tempted by money. Hey, here's a check. Here's you'll be independently wealthy. Just kind of go along to get along. It doesn't even have to be very overt. It doesn't have to be an exact quid pro quo. Just that, oh, you're friendly towards certain interests. You're more willing to listen to a lobbyist from an agricultural combine or from a pharmaceutical company because, in the back of your mind, oh, this guy just gave me $100,000 to my campaign fund, right? It's why once upon a time they didn't allow editorials to be and advertising to be on the same page. And it used to be in my profession that it was considered bad form for a car publication to take you were suspicious of what you were reading about a new car if on the opposite page there's an ad and that publication is supported by Ford or General Motors because hey, they're not going to say anything particularly bad about those car companies because they know where their bread is buttered.
Definite conflict of interest. Hey, let's talk about gas for just a moment, or at least gas prices. Um, Clearly, there are some conflicting messages coming out of the Persian Gulf as to whether or not the Strait of Hormuz is open and who's blockading it, and so forth. This much I do know: gas is not getting cheaper. What's your take on the gas prices and where we go from here?
Well, I haven't seen any volatility in prices at the pump here. They're still about $4 a gallon. Now, we've seen on the markets, a lot of people have been making a lot of money off of the way the market has been going up and down as far as the cost of a barrel of crude oil, which is something that's not really directly relevant to you or I, because, you or I, we don't go out and buy a barrel of crude oil, we buy gas. But every time Trump tweets or says something, even when it's grossly factually untrue, that seems to indicate that the Strait of Hormuz is open, for example. It isn't. That we're going to, work with the Iranians to get the mines out of there. That's not happening. The markets respond, and the cost of crude oil goes down, and people make bank on that by shorting and doing all these greasy things that people do in the stock market, and it benefits people who are leveraging that sort of information. But to get back to your point, no, for you and I, gas prices remain high. And given that tomorrow is the end of the deadline that Trump put forward for the Iranians to accede to all of his outrageous demands, probably the war is going to start up again, and probably, we'll be grateful that we're only paying $4 a gallon. Well, because soon we might be paying $5 a gallon, depending on how things go.
Now, you were telling me before we went on the air here that was it Tucker Carlson who issued an apology for helping to elect Trump this last time?
Yeah,
I haven't seen the video,
I
but
haven't. He did an interview. I can't recall. I didn't recognize the person that he was interviewing, but it was a clip that I saw, and I confirmed it. It wasn't some AI generated thing. And he was just ruefully expressing that he feels ashamed to have been complicit. That's the word he used in the election of Trump, because of course Tucker was one of Trump's greatest supporters during 2024. Even like stood beside the guy at campaign events and so on. And he's just appalled by what Trump has been doing lately. And he said, "Look, I'm sorry. I got fooled. I can relate to that. So did I. I voted for him." But I also take some comfort in the fact that we were betrayed. We went into the voting booth with good intentions. We heard America first. We heard no more wars. We heard that the policies were going to be enacted to make the average American's lot better. Well, all those promises, as far as I can tell, have been thrown in the can. And so it's not that I'm walking away from Trump or Tucker. I can't speak for him, but speaking for myself, he walked away from us. Trump walked away from us. I don't feel any obligation to continue to support a person who betrayed me. And I think Tucker feels the same way.
and I don't know if you get this, depending on who I talk to, some people are still like, but we still need to get behind him, get behind Trump and get behind the Republicans in this election, particularly the uniparty Republicans in Washington, D.C., because, otherwise you're just handing it all over to the Democrats. And I don't know, man, that uniparty to me is becoming pretty hard to deny, especially at the federal level.
It's what they tell us every 4 years, isn't it? Oh, you got to vote for the GOP because if you don't, the alternative is much worse. And we end up getting the
Yep,
much
things will
worse
get
alternative,
worse.
right? Even
Yeah.
worse. But they might actually have gotten better. There's an argument, and it resonates with me. I think that there's some validity to it that had Trump lost in 2024, the people who constitute the bulk of Trump's support wouldn't be demoralized right now. They would be coalesced and they would be doing something cohesive to oppose a Harris Waltz administration. Whereas now everybody's bickering amongst themselves, instead of
Very
focusing
true.
on the problems. It's disastrous, demoralization and just depression. I would characterize those two words best characterize the state of MAGA right now. And it's being routed because of Trump. I don't think it would have been routed if Harris and Walz had emerged victorious.
I don't know if you caught the video clip of Senator Rand Paul questioning Marco Rubio, our Secretary of State. This was a good question, and you can see Rubio kind of melting down as he's being asked if another country were to come in here and cleanly and mostly bloodlessly, in other words, there's very few casualties, it's done in 4 hours, but they were to take our president right here from our soil and take him away to be held for trial, would we consider that an act of war? And the equivocation and the blustering on the part of Marco Rubio was something to behold. But you know, Rand Paul gets accused of, well, he's so anti-American, and how could he even compare such a thing? And the bottom line is Congress still is the body, according to the Constitution, that has the authority to declare war. And when we allow our government to engage in acts of war against other nations, I think it's worth consulting the rule book, if you will, and maybe asking some questions why that's not being done. And it's very discouraging to me to see someone, especially sitting at the level of Secretary of State, sitting there trying to make the case, trying to engage in the sophistry necessary to convince people that no, it's different when we do it.
Yeah, I'm with you 100%. It's indicative of a form of mental illness. It goes beyond dishonesty, because it literally is comparable. It literally would be the same thing. If some other country decided that Trump has committed, for example, war crimes, which you could make a very strong case that he has, and said we have to bring this man to justice. He has to be taken out. He's a thug. He's a mafia don. He's a danger. Same sorts of things that Trump was saying about Maduro in Venezuela, right? So at least I would like to see officials acknowledge that and go, yeah, well, but we did it because of X, Y, and Z, and acknowledging, in other words, that yeah, we're doing this, and if somebody else did it, it would effectively be the same thing. Sanity lies in that. What we're dealing with right now is a type of insanity, where something that's obviously true will not be acknowledged as true by these people. Everything is viewed through the lens of this kind of political correctness. It's not so much, oh, race, sex, gender. It's like you have to hold the right ideological view, even when it's obviously contrary to what the objective facts are.
So let's take a moment here and let's talk about some practical ways that we can respond that don't play into the hands of those who are trying to basically paint us into a corner. I know a lot of people are feeling anger. I feel it myself from time to time. And sometimes it feels strong to be angry, right? That's oh, now I'm righteously fired up. Anger's not enough though. And in fact, it can be a trap. If you're foolish enough, somebody can get you angry enough, they can steer you in a direction of their choosing, and you won't even be aware of it. Why? Because you're blowing steam out of your ears.
I think it's important to vent that anger in a productive way. Just a couple of days ago, we went on a hike and went up. I don't know if you're familiar with McAfee's Knob. It's one of the most scenic points on the Appalachian Trail. It's in Southwest Virginia. It's just a panoramic overlook of the valley. Anyway, going on a hike like that, it sort of acted as a release, a pressure release valve for me to be out in the woods to see beautiful things. It's important to do that. Life is not all bad. We still have a lot of very good things to be grateful for. And I think I don't think it's glib or Pollyannish to think about, hey, I should be grateful for these things, even though over here there's some bad things. We still have a lot that's under our own control. Do something productive. Do in your own world that makes you feel good, that enhances your quality of life. And I think that's a good counterbalance to all the awfulness that's going on around us.
I like that suggestion, and I'm going to add one thing to it, um, because I look, I feel the anger from time to time too, and one of the things that I have found that really helps me bring things back into focus, and it comes down to the gratitude you're talking about, the appreciation for what you have, and feeling better about your situation. If I can find someone who needs my help. And it could be something simple. It could be holding a door for somebody. It could be, helping someone who's, out struggling in their yard, trying to, get weeds pulled or something. If you can find a way to meaningfully serve another person with no expectation of, you're going to get a reward or some kind of accolades or your picture in the paper, just do it because someone else needs help and you see it and you're willing to act. That does something to lift you out of those doldrums where everything is going wrong and there's nothing I can do about it. And it's surprising how normal the world starts to feel in a very short time when you're actually helping another person.
Yep, I like that too. These little acts of courtesy and civility are ultimately what does build civilization. You and I are old enough to remember when men held the door, and if there was a little old lady that needed help crossing the street, well, you did that. If somebody's car was broken down and you were in a position to help them, you helped them. Again, we have power to do these things. They can't take that away from us. And I think that we should exercise that power because it does scale up. If more of us did that more often, I think our mood would be better and we would feel more like we live in a sane country rather than the prison system that we live in right now.
And there's something undeniable that happens when you know, actually know because of your behavior, that you are a source of good in the world, even if it's a small source. If it's, I mean, this is so much more than I've got the right avatar on my social media. Look, I support the current
Yes.
thing, which that's the cheap way. That's the easy way of trying to be a good person. But if you can just see the opportunities to be good, to help someone who is in need in big or small ways, um, give it a try. I
Yep.
think
And
I
I'll
think
add
people would
one
be
other thing
surprised.
too. Little courtesies like when you're driving on the road, you look in your rearview mirror, and maybe move over, let people by. Just stuff like that. Wave. Don't be a jerk. Be conscious not only of yourself, but of yourself in relation to other people.
Anything automotive you want to touch on before we wrap things up for today?
Yeah, briefly. I've got an article. I just actually put it on the site. I was taken to task a little bit by somebody who faulted me for constantly harping on how expensive vehicles are, and who said that, well, you're not just acknowledging the fact that it's inflation. Well, it isn't just inflation. Inflation is certainly a factor. I enumerated a number of cars that are available right now. You can get them in Mexico for $14,000, $15,000, brand new cars. And these aren't like, sketchy jalopies that don't have any airbag. They have airbags. They've got fuel injected engine, and they're readily available over there. Why aren't we able to buy them over here? And there's two reasons. One is that the federal government makes it difficult from a regulatory point of view. And the other is that the manufacturers don't want you to buy affordable cars. They want you to buy more expensive cars and sign up for 6-year payments rather than 3-year payments. They built a business model on that. And Americans have gotten much more comfortable with that. Mexico and a lot of the other parts of the world are still a lot like America used to be, where people generally live more within their means and they're leery of signing up for 6 years of $700 a month car payments. So we could have these things, and I'm trying to publicize that in the hope that perhaps a groundswell will develop that will demand that we have access to these things, just like other people in the rest of the world do.
Here, here. I'll include a link to your website in the show notes for today's show. Eric, once again, thanks for joining us. Great as always to visit with you.
Likewise, Brian. Thank you.